just entering the room, we're just going to give it a couple of seconds. The internet takes a little while to let everyone in. It's a little bit slow sometimes. So just give it a sort of minute and a half and we will begin the event. So yeah, thanks for your patience. Just very brief few minutes while we wait for everybody to enter the room. Welcome to those who are joining us. We're just giving it a couple of minutes so that everyone's internet connections have the time to kind of enter the room. Sometimes it just takes a few minutes for some reason. So yeah, thanks for bearing with us. Okay, so it looks like it's about time to get started. So thank you everyone who's joined us for this final session of the Human Rights and Climate Change Symposium. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know that we have people joining us from all over the world. My name is Dr. Emily Jones and I work at the School of Law at the University of Essex, and I will be your chair for this panel, which is looking at multiple different perspectives on the rights of nature. So I think we have a really fantastic panel lined up. I mean, I would say that because I invited the speakers, of course, but I obviously chose them for a reason because I think they're all awesome. But of course, before we get into the kind of panel itself, we wanted to give a little bit of context about exactly why this panel is being situated within an event on human rights and climate change. So I guess the rights of nature is in some ways kind of emerging as a response in part to climate change and sort of wider environmental devastation. And of course, these things just keep happening and things keep getting worse and worse. And of course, many key milestones have been achieved, the recognition of different human rights, successes in climate litigation and beyond. And many of these successes have been discussed in the symposium so far, and lots of positive achievements there. But it's clear that a lot more needs to be done. The law, in my opinion, is very anthropocentric and is very much set up in a way which prioritizes human needs over others, and most primarily economic needs. And we can kind of see this in lots of different areas of the law. If you think about human rights and the environment itself, in the end, it's really about human interests. And there's a need to kind of think about that in a little bit of a different way. How can we start thinking beyond this human centrism and think more holistically about the environment? So kind of the proposition was, well, how can we think about new approaches to climate change and human rights? And rights of nature seems like an ideal one. And obviously it's one of my own research interests. So I would also say that. But, you know, it's kind of emerging in response to, as I said, kind of climate change, environmental degradation, and a growing number of actors are beginning to call for the rights of nature to be recognised in lots of different contexts. And we're going to hear about some of them today. So the rights of nature may provide a kind of new way of thinking about environmental law, and a kind of more post-anthropocentric vision is the idea behind this panel. And again, we will hear about lots of different contexts, but for those of you that might be a bit new to the rights of nature, you know, these rights have been recognized in different ways. And I know that our speaker, Craig Kaufman, will be speaking about that, but in lots of different countries, from Ecuador to New Zealand to the US, Bangladesh, etc. So, but they are recognized in very different ways. So this panel is really going to explore what the rights of nature are and evaluate the different ways they can be framed and analyze their usefulness in kind of protecting the environment. So before I introduce our excellent speakers, I also just wanted to say a few words about the recent passing away of Professor Christopher Stone. So he sadly passed away last month, and he was a key voice in thinking about the rights of nature. His seminal essay, Should Trees Have Standing, was published in 1972, and has informed and inspired generations of environmental lawyers and activists. Professor Stone's passing away marks a great loss for the environmental law community, and I would like to take this opportunity to send my condolences to his friends and family. So on that note, I would like to introduce our speakers for today, and in the order that they'll be speaking in. So we're going to be starting off with the fantastic Dr. Craig Kaufman. So Dr. Kaufman is an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon, where he specializes in environmental politics, ecological law, and sustainable development. He's the author of 2 books, most recently, The Politics of Rights of Nature, Strategies for Building a More Sustainable Future, which I think comes out in a couple of months with MIT Press. And, one month, okay, and numerous articles on environmental politics. Kaufman is also an active member of the United Nations Knowledge Network on Harmony with Nature and a founding member of the academic hub of the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature. And Craig will be discussing the differences between rights of nature laws and the different approaches taken in different contexts. So that's where we're going to kind of begin to start off with. And from there, we'll be moving on to Ivan Vargas. So Ivan is a PhD candidate in natural resource sciences at McGill University, where he's also a leadership for the Ecozoic Fellow. Sorry, words. He is also associate editor for Challenges in Sustainability, and is a lawyer with a wide-ranging background, including master's degrees in bioscience and the law from the National University of Columbia and Latin American studies from Duke University. And there's a lot more that you can see in his bio, which we have up on our webpage, of course. So his research ethnographically follows Indigenous practitioners, scientists, legal scholars, and ritual plants across territories, documents, and courts of justice to contribute to a larger paradigm shift, from reductionist environmental law and governance modes to ecological, system-based, and other than human jurisprudence in post-conflict Colombia. His interests include earth law, indigenous law and cosmologies, ethnography, and his Amazon region. So Ivan will be discussing indigenous worldviews and the rights of nature, and will be drawing in particular on his ethnographic encounters with indigenous peoples in Amazonia. So from framing what the rights of nature are with Craig to kind of the more indigenous perspectives with Ivan, we will then turn to Dr. Harriet Harden-Davies, who is an Ocean Nexus postdoctoral research fellow at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. So Harriet's research interests span ocean science, stewardship and sustainability, the development of a new United Nations for marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And this is a key focus of her research and her policy engagement work. She is a guest investigator at the Marine Policy Centre of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, co-leader of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, and membership of the UNESCO Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission group of experts on capacity and development, and a similar group, informal working group of early career ocean professionals. Her previous roles include visiting Science Diplomacy Fellow at Tufts University, consultant to the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and manager of policy and projects at the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. She has a PhD in ocean law and policy and a BSc in marine biology and oceanography. And she's also a keen scuba diver and sailor, which is very important points. So Dr. Harden-Davies will be discussing the much needed application of the rights of nature to international law. So taking a kind of more global perspective through a focus on the law of the sea and discussions of the ongoing negotiations to create an international instrument on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So from framing of rights of nature to indigenous to kind of law of the sea and ocean governance, which I think will be very interesting. So a couple of housekeeping rules, and then enough from me because you're probably getting a bit bored of me. Each speaker will have around 15 to 20 minutes to speak each. There will be hopefully around 20 minutes for Q&A, depending on how good they are at keeping time. So for the Q&A, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's like a little Q&A box. So you click that and you can type your question in there. So I will be looking at the questions and asking them of our speakers. If you do want to be anonymous, if you want to remain anonymous when asking your question, there is a little tab that you can click to say, ask the question anonymously. So if you don't click that tab, I may read out your name. I can't promise that I won't. So definitely click that if you don't want me to. And please note that this session is being recorded. So if you want to remain anonymous, then please do that. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Craig Colton, whenever you are ready. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, for inviting me to speak on this panel. Let me just see if I can share my screen quickly. Can you all see the first slide? Okay, great, thanks. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I want to start by noting that in practice, people use the term rights of nature to refer to two distinct things. The first is a legal philosophy, which is often referred to as earth jurisprudence or earth law. And the second is a growing number of legal provisions that recognize ecosystems as legal subjects with rights. And there are currently at least 180 such rights of nature laws in at least 18 countries around the world, and more are being adopted all the time. So it's really a fast growing global phenomenon. So I wanted to first just say a little bit about earth law, because I think it's important to set the stage for a discussion of different rights of nature laws. So what is earth jurisprudence or earth law? All right, it's an emerging philosophy of law that asserts there is a lawful order to the universe that maintains a web of life in which all elements of nature, including humans, are inextricably connected to one another through interdependent and reciprocal relationships. And because human well-being is dependent on the well-being of the ecosystems that sustain all life, earth jurisprudence argues that humans must adapt their legal, political, economic, and social systems to be consistent with the way the natural world actually works, rather than fighting against this lawful order and trying to force nature to conform to human will. And this is the fundamental transformation in systems and paradigms that rights of nature advocates believe is necessary to address the looming climate and biodiversity crises. Now, according to David Boyd, the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, this disconnect between Western law and the natural laws governing the order of the universe stems from three related ideas. Right? The first is anthropocentrism, this widespread human belief that we humans are separate from and superior to the rest of the natural world. The second is that everything in nature constitutes our property, which we have the right to use as we see fit, including to destroy it if we want. And the third idea is that we can and should pursue limitless economic growth as the paramount objective of modern society. And so earth jurisprudence scholars argue that embedding these ideas into human governance systems, including conventional environmental law, has caused the systematic destruction of ecosystems needed to sustain life, and it's driving climate change. Earth jurisprudence aims to fundamentally transform legal, socioeconomic, and governance systems, replacing these three destructive ideas with a different paradigm that prioritizes sustaining ecosystem functioning. So in contrast to conventional law, earth jurisprudence recognizes that humans are part of nature, and consequently, human well-being is dependent on the well-being of the ecosystems that provide the conditions for life. And this is, again, because nature is comprised of nested living ecosystems whose parts are all interconnected through reciprocal relationships. So all elements of nature, including humans, are more accurately understood as members of what ecological scientists call biotic communities, rather than individual stocks of resources. And rather than exponential growth and consumption, Earth law prioritizes achieving and maintaining balance and a dynamic equilibrium within healthy ecosystems. And this is encapsulated by the catchphrase, living in harmony with nature, which you now hear in a lot of policy circles. So to this end, Earth law argues that ecosystems and their component species have the right to exist, thrive, evolve, and be restored when damaged. And this is, of course, where the rights of nature laws come in. Of course, legal provisions recognizing ecosystems as subjects with rights are not the only way to codify Earth jurisprudence principles. I think this is important to note. But they are one of the most common ways of doing so in Western legal systems. Now, I emphasize this distinction between rights of nature as legal philosophy and as legal provision to highlight that the ultimate goal of the rights of nature movement is paradigm change, right? Changing the way people understand humans' relationship with nature and their responsibility towards it in order to inspire more ecologically sustainable behaviors. And rights of nature legal provisions are seen as a tool to achieve this goal. They're not themselves the ultimate goal, right? They're a tool. And I'll come back to this point in a bit. But to explain why this distinction matters, I want to first highlight some important differences in how various rights of nature laws are structured. So my colleague Pam Martin and I have identified two distinct models that are really ideal types, if you will, right? So one model, which we call the nature's rights model, is illustrated by rights of nature laws in Ecuador, Bolivia, and the US, and some other places. And in this model, all of nature within the legal jurisdiction is recognized as having rights. Most importantly, these laws recognize unique substantive rights, including ecosystems' right to exist, to maintain the integrity and functioning of their cycles, the right to evolve naturally and be restored when damaged. And in addition, these laws empower any person to speak on behalf of nature to defend nature's rights. Consequently, the model tends to address rights of nature reactively, with people seeking to defend nature's rights in court when violations are either imminent or have already occurred. By contrast, what we call the legal personhood model recognizes particular ecosystems or species as legal persons. So New Zealand, India, and Colombia are some examples. There are many more. Legal personhood grants ecosystems the same rights and liabilities held by, say, humans and corporations, including the right to own property, incur debts, petition the courts, and so forth. And while these laws grant ecosystems legal standing, they do not guarantee ecosystems' right to maintain their integrity or be restored. However, specific guardians are not only appointed to speak on behalf of an ecosystem, they are obliged to do so in both legal and policy arenas. And often these guardians are embedded in new governance institutions charged with managing the ecosystem in a way that ensures the health and well-being of the ecosystem. And this gives the ecosystem a voice via its guardians in decision-making processes regarding the management of the ecosystem, allowing rights of nature to be protected more proactively, reducing the need to turn to the courts. While these differences in guardianship are important, due to time constraints, I'm going to, in this talk, focus on the implications of recognizing unique rights for nature versus extending legal personhood to ecosystems. Because legal personhood is already established in law and has a long history of being applied to non-human entities, it is, of course, more easily transferable from one legal system to another. And this has no doubt facilitated the rapid proliferation of rights of nature legal provisions. But the key point I want to emphasize here is that legal personhood can establish rights of nature stripped of Earth jurisprudence content. And I argue that this is problematic and potentially counterproductive, both for achieving rights of nature advocates' goal of transforming paradigms and systems, and for environmental protection more generally. So what are the problems with legal personhood? Right, there are several problems. First, the language and conceptual framing of legal personhood distorts the relationship between humans and other members of biotic communities identified by Earth jurisprudence and ecological science. It anthropomorphizes ecosystems in a way that ends up reproducing the disconnect between human law and the laws governing the natural world, recreating the problems that plague conventional environmental law. And this can be seen, for example, through the Indian court ruling granting legal personhood to the Ganga and Yamuna rivers. So just as an example, on March 2017, the High Court of the Indian state of Uttarakhand declared the Ganga and Yamuna rivers to be, quote, legal persons having the status of a legal person with all corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities of a legal person, unquote. Now, noting that the river's well-being is threatened due to neglect, the Uttarakhand High Court invoked the legal doctrine in loco parentis, which of course you know is Latin for in the place of a parent, to make a set of government bodies and officers responsible for acting on behalf of the rivers for their protection and conservation. And as you know, courts commonly use this legal principle to appoint guardians for children or incapacitated people who cannot defend themselves. But adopting this same logic, the court appointed Uttarakhand's chief secretary and several other government representatives as guardians. Now, while no doubt this was well-intentioned, the use of in loco parentis illustrates the problems of inserting rights of nature into existing anthropocentric legal frameworks stripped of Earth jurisprudence content. So it frames humans as the powerful parent while nature is the helpless child. And this notion of legal guardianship is appropriate among humans, but violates fundamental Earth jurisprudence principles when applied to the human-nature relationship. Nature knows better, arguably, than humans how its ecosystems should function and evolve. And given that nature provides the conditions needed to sustain human life, nature is arguably better understood as the parent in the human-nature relationship. So from the Earth jurisprudence perspective, guardianship is not so much about managing nature like a parent would manage a child, but rather guarding the relationship between humans and other members of the biotic community. And again, as I said, the goal is managing human behavior to maintain balance so that the ecosystem on which all members, including humans, rely for their well-being continues to function. By distorting this understanding of what guardianship is about, legal personhood can undermine the goal of normative and system transformation at the heart of the Rights of Nature project. A second problem with legal personhood is that it creates legal liabilities for ecosystems. All right, this has already produced perverse incentives, including in the Uttarakhand High Court ruling that I just mentioned. Right, the in loco parentis doctrine requires guardians to assume the liabilities of their charges. And the Uttarakhand authorities, appointed as guardians, recognized this as problematic when applied to the human-nature relationship. They immediately filed a petition with India's Supreme Court to overturn the Uttarakhand High Court ruling. And among other concerns, the petition complains that if the rivers flood and someone dies, as regularly happens, victims' families could potentially sue for damages against the chief secretary. And the petition asks the Supreme Court to determine whether the state government, as the river's legal parents, would be liable to bear the financial burden of harms caused to humans by the river flooding as part of the natural water cycle. Now, I would argue that the idea that ecosystems have the same responsibilities to humans that humans have toward each other is absurd. We cannot hold a river liable for flooding or hold the climate accountable for damage caused by sea level rise. In fact, the idea of holding ecosystems accountable to human law merely reproduces the misguided idea that humans can bend the laws of nature to their will. But as Bill McKibben notes, physics doesn't do compromise. At the same time, the fact that ecosystems do not bear human responsibilities, this does not mean that ecosystems should not have rights. It just means that we should not extend human rights to nature. Because each member of a biotic community plays a unique role in maintaining the functioning of an ecosystem, each member has unique responsibilities to the whole community and in turn unique rights. And consequently, rights of nature laws should be structured in a way that recognizes different elements of nature as having distinct substantive rights. To paraphrase Christopher Stone and Thomas Berry, trees should have tree rights, rivers should have river rights, fish should have fish rights, of course, humans should have human rights, but ecosystems should have ecosystem rights. So as Thomas Berry stated, quote, "The difference is qualitative, not quantitative." Now, beyond these philosophical arguments, there is evidence that granting legal personhood to ecosystems without recognizing their own substantive rights can undermine societal values favoring environmental protection. Aaron O'Donnell examines the historical performance of environmental water managers created in the mid-1990s as a proxy for studying the effect of legal personhood for rivers. Now, environmental water managers are organizations with legal personhood status that manage water for environmental benefit. They have essentially the same legal form as rivers with legal personhood status, represented by human guardians. And she finds that in many cases, these environmental water managers created new cultural narratives that framed river ecosystems as just another water user competing with water users for water resources. As she says, quote, "a mere participant in the water market," unquote. So the legal personhood anthropomorphized ecosystems in a way that stripped them of their status as worthy of protection. Framed as a competitor in water markets, humans began to see nature as a legal entity that could and should protect itself, and so no longer required human protection. And O'Donnell shows that in some cases, this produced a weakening of statutory environmental protections. But O'Donnell acknowledges that legal personhood has worked better in places like New Zealand, where ecosystems represented by their guardians are inserted into collaborative integrated ecosystem management bodies that operate according to indigenous cultural values rather than the logic of market competition. And I argue that the reason legal personhood is less problematic in New Zealand is because Earth jurisprudence is incorporated into New Zealand's rights of nature laws, but via provisions that recognize Maori conceptions of the human-nature relationship and that allow the recovery of indigenous customary governance systems that are consistent with Earth jurisprudence. In other words, it was not the legal personhood status that made the difference, but rather the insertion of Earth jurisprudence through protections for indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and practices. So the point I want to emphasize from the India-New Zealand comparison is that if the goal is transforming systems to be more ecologically sustainable, changing the paradigm undergirding Western legal systems and societies, for example, to better equip us to address climate change, then rights of nature laws must not be stripped of Earth jurisprudence content, as happened in India. Again, the reason New Zealand doesn't fit O'Donnell's cautionary tale is that Earth jurisprudence was inserted into New Zealand's rights of nature laws via provisions recognizing Maori cosmovision and authorizing the recovery of traditional guardianship arrangements. And this shows that legal personhood for ecosystems is less problematic when it's accompanied by new governance institutions that manage ecosystems according to indigenous cultural values consistent with Earth jurisprudence, as happened in New Zealand and also as Colombia. But what about non-indigenous societies where implementing Earth jurisprudence does not involve recovering ancestral knowledge, but instead is about radically transforming systems according to a fundamentally different paradigm? Here, legal personhoods can simply adapt rights of nature legal provisions to fit within existing anthropocentric legal and socioeconomic systems. And this will at best be meaningless and at worst produce perverse outcomes. So in these cases, the transformative potential of rights of nature likely requires legal provisions recognizing nature as possessing unique substantive rights and humans possessing responsibilities toward nature. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Dr. Kaufman, for that fascinating presentation and a really nice kind of way to introduce, I think, the different provisions which exist. So thank you so much for that. I would now like to hand over to Ivan Vargas for his presentation next. And I can see that somebody's asking about when there will be Q&A. If you put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, we'll have time for that at the end. So please do put those questions there. So Ivan, over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so very much for the invitation again. I'm going to share my screen and also Dr. Kaufman for that presentation. I think that will be truly truthful and truly a wonderful conversation around those topics as well. Let's see. Okay. So, Rise of Nature, Indigenous Legal Traditions and Comparison in the Colombian Amazon. So, I'm going to start by talking about this plant, Paulina Joco, a plant I work with in the Amazon. From the mind of plants to mind of the world. With the serene joy of decades of experience and struggle, Abuelo D, an elder from the Cofán community in Bajo Putumayo, Colombian Amazon, was seated on an old-looking stool holding a piece of cord. P passed away, he said, and then remained silent. As I introduced myself and paid my respects, I was able to recognize the skin of a plant in the elder's hand. El abuelo es una matica de Joco, the elder is Joco, I thought as I was musing about plants as persons in this region. Are human engagements with other beings limited to the dubious epiphany that we all depend on the mineral, vegetal, and animal life of the world? That we all interexist in a way? What are then our responsibilities to this interexistence? The plant, usually harvested in the wild and sometimes cultivated in chagres, which is an Amazonian slash and burn cultivation system. Paulina Joco is a tropical climber vine that grows up to 15 meters. Conventionally used as a breakfast infusion across the Amazonian regions of Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, Joco allies hunger and stimulates the muscles to endure long working hours in the forest. To prepare the Joco beverage, one carefully rasps the flame layer of the plant with a knife and dissolves the resulting sawdust in cold water. Besides its tonic properties, Joco is an anti-malarial antipyretic and a remedy for the treatment of bilious disease, which is frequent in the region of Putumayo where I work. Joco has emetic, psychoactive, contraceptive, and even abortive properties, and people in Amazonia consider that it gives advice to the person who ingests it. More than a plant, however, Joco is person, and more than a person, it is a mode of relation, a mode of learning and co-participating in forest life. An encounter. The bitter and early taste of the Joco infusion sparked an instant sensation of warmth in my limbs and my head, and to then ignite a mild chuma or dizziness as my body quivered in slow motion. The chuma grew stronger and my stomach sort of turned on itself, while the bile and the plant were both expelled with the urgency of a powerful relief. Bewildered and grateful, I imagined the vibrant presence of a gentle song sprouting from the surrounding trees. Learning. Learning with the plant is encountering the plant's mind as a body, and this requires a particular form of training or corporeal discipline. Learning with Joco as mind, however, exceeds liberal deference towards this vegetal other. It is about learning how to seriously and carefully engage with the Joco's perspective and seeing what that is making the world from that vantage point too. More than representation of an external reality, this learning process requires the ingestion of the plant as a somebody rather than as something. So the initial learning outcomes are all essential to the task at hand, these bodily outcomes. They are both cleansing and learning techniques. They are both forms of communication with the plant and the larger mind of the forest. So this is a Pensamientos en Lugar de Fuego, which is a beautiful image painting by an Inca friend, Benjamin Hakanamihoy, and it's a pictorial representation of his chumas or his visions with that particular plant in the Amazon. Plants like Joco help us to put the mind back into the body, heart, and stomach while removing whatever interrupts our mente fresca, or our ability to perform good and beautiful thinking, as the elders say in this region. In my experience, learning with Joco is quite explicitly a form of ethical training to become better partners for our wounded and flourishing earth, an ethical learning of sorts to orient good action in the world. Mindful plants teach us that humans are or can be mindful beings as well, that co-create the world with plants and non-plants full of mind. So I just want to start, I'm going to continue this presentation talking about how I encountered the rise of nature through ethnographic experience. So I'm going to just ask a couple of questions, challenges, then propose a methodology that I call a comparative praxis of legal cosmologies, which is how we encounter ethnographically these plants, these beings and the rights they are holding across different cultural differences, you know. Recent norms and judicial decisions on the rise of nature place life at the center of legal discourse in Latin America. This legal revolution thus purports to upend the paradigm of solely human legal subjectivity in recognizing the personhood of nature. Nevertheless, the right of nature approach seems to depend on an assumption that the form of law is primarily linguistic and propositional. In this way, it reveals another critical assumption, that law is a system of norms made by humans to regulate human conduct in relation to an external existing natural world, whereby insisting on a separation between law and life processes. I argue that recognizing nature as a legal person and subject of rights falls short if law is understood as a matter of human language only, and nature is understood as an adequate conception of cosmological interdependencies between all that exists. The thesis of law as language seems to reinforce then a much contested rift between mind and body, culture and nature, among other boundary-making notions at the root of modern thought and practice. In what sense, then, could conjuring other than human beings as agents of legal meaning, for example, our Joco plant in the beginning of this presentation, rather than mere recipients of a state-sanctioned rights transform what we mean by law and rights of nature in Latin America? So, furthermore, I want to ask these two questions and to keep in mind throughout the presentation. How can we bridge the gap then between imagination, methodology and adjudication and learning for that matter in a new dimension of law that we might call ontological? And also, can we foster a legal activation of relationality? I'm here drawing from anthropologist Arturo Escobar. That is the activation of relational thinking, it says, in concrete scenarios of legal adjudication and learning. So there are some conceptual tools that I have come to learn working with indigenous communities in Southern Colombia. So the vital indigenous principle of radical interdependency among the Cofana and the Inga, for example, suggests that entities do not precede the relationships that comprise them. And this is closer to certain post-humanist thinking as well. In fact, all existence, whether animals, minerals, plants, human, or rivers, co-emerge relationally. They foreground. For example, in Amazonia, animal, plants, mountains, and rivers, among other beings, are endowed with a form of interiority or soul with attributes that are identical to those of humans, such as reflexive consciousness, intentionality, affective life, and respect for ethical principles. In this region, the world is not intrinsically organized through the stable categories of nature and culture, since all beings, human and not, share a common interiority concealed underneath the mask of their own bodies. And this theory of the self affords quite a different understanding of the law as something beyond cultural and human meaning. For indigenous communities in Southern Colombia, legal protocols, for example, come into being through ritual and everyday relations between animals and plants like Joco and others, spirits and humans mediated by the Taita, or an often traditional political authority, but also a medical authority, or shaman, as it is most widely known, or medicine person. Applied in instances ranging from ritual procedures to research contracts and from prior consultation between the state and local authorities to the allocation of justice in the community itself, legal meaning, and I want to use this idea, in these protocols is the emerging effect of interbeing engagements rather than the will of the human expressed through the vehicle of language. So there is a bodily kind of a content to this idea of law emerging from territories. So this legal cosmology, let's say, challenges Western, this is a broad so-called Western category, legal theory, or at least on at least two fronts. First, it expands the arc of legal subjectivity to include humans and more than human beings as ways of life or movement, rather than settled bodies with predesigned limits. An ontological commitment to relations, however, rather than substances, has a special bearing in concrete scenarios of adjudication where legal redress requires politically contentious demarcations of social ecosystems. Secondly, this relational principle exceeds or destabilizes the dualistic categories that structure legal thinking from the ground up in modern law. So how does a relational ontology, let's use this expression, transform our understanding and practice of the rights of nature beyond the mere recognition of a state-granted right to natural entities? What does it mean to grant rights to relationships instead of substances or persons? I claim first that although it promises to draw on these relational ontologies, the rights of nature does so in a limited way. Taking as a legal language to shift the idea of actors, namely as a human-only issue, the rights of nature approach transposes the notion of the individual as a legal subject onto non-human fluid agencies without integrating their constitutive interdependencies, as actually Dr. Kaufman was suggesting in his presentation. Secondly, and perhaps more crucially, the rights of nature's realpolitik in our context in Latin America is far removed from the ontological commitment to the non-human as a value in itself. So the rights of nature approach then faces several productive, theoretical, and practical challenges that I've called diffuse nature, collision of cosmologies, discreteness, and human mediation. I'll go rapidly through all these different ideas. So the idea of diffuse nature is that the notion of nature is diffuse because this word might refer to humans and non-humans, or to non-human beings only. So this means that we need a radically different, non-modern way of relating to these cosmological interdependencies. Collision of cosmologies refers to the idea that the rights of nature clause extends personhood to a generic nature that is immediately equated, for example, to the Andean notion of Pachamama in the context of Ecuador and the Aymara and Quechua-speaking communities. The Quechua-speaking people, however, for these people, Pachamama encompasses both earth, so space, and time. the sun and the moon, so different celestial bodies, the goddess of fertility and the prime origin of all that exists. So Pachamama actually exceeds the idea of Mother Nature because it encompasses both this mode of relating, but also these spiritual dimensions. So discreteness, this nature is composed by millions of species, and each aspect of nature involves a different social legal interest. As a result, it is impossible to articulate legal claims for each component of nature, which means that a democracy of rights based on discrete beings is impracticable in my view, and might lead to an identity politics for nature with challenges that are similar to those already faced by human groups, for example, in the context of multicultural constitutions. Finally, human mediation, the idea, the self-standing of non-humans, as it were, is impossible within a legal system based on an idea of law as language only, simply because language is not the only way in which these cosmological interdependencies express themselves, or a conception of law as a human-only system of meaning. So these challenges, in my view, raise at least three crucial questions for legal theory. What should be considered as existent for concrete scenarios of adjudication? That's the first issue. What kind of people should act on whose behalf? And when I mean people, I say humans and non-humans. And what is the procedure for adjudicating rights in context of pervasive extractivist practices and war? So the preceding assessment calls for a radical transformation of the rights of nature legal imagination, in my view. So, and I propose this methodological framework for that. So by following the rights of nature to their underlying live worlds and bringing then the latter back to the surface of adjudication, I propose what I'm calling a tectonic reading methodology as an invitation to harness rights of nature's potential to heal the web of life. A tectonic reading of the law refers to the act of comparing two different, albeit partially connected, enactments of the law. In this context, I use the word proposition as a way to designate a unit of comparison. For the purposes of this argument, in particular, the phrases X has a right to Y or X has a responsibility towards Y are examples of such a propositional language. In addition, I use the term tectonic in two different ways. As the underlying plates of the Earth's crust shifting us inexorably around the globe, clashing into each other, following the rise of nature relations all the way to their underlying life worlds is first and foremost to encounter the collision of two different modes of creating worlds in the Andean Amazonian region, for example, through the law, namely the language of separation, the idea that nature and humans are separated, and other conception that is actually enacted through practices in Amazon, which is the idea of interdependence, hence my initial vignette about the Joco. Secondly, the act of weaving, for example, a fabric like that woven by the Ica community in northern Colombia. The Indo-European root of tectonic texts, I want to emphasize this, means to weave and to make a wicker or wattle framework for mud's walls in the Amazon and in the Andes. In fact, the words text, texture, and context all derive from the word textere, which comes from the same root as text. So that's why I use this expression of text to refer to kind of this tectonic feature of these interdependencies. And I certainly use these two words analogically. So a corollary of the radical ontological difference between separation and interdependence, namely what I'm calling the state proposition and cosmological proposition, or text as Ron or rights of nature as text, will be akin to a state proposition that enacts rights for nature as a delocalized abstract person. At the same time, the rights of nature as text, or this kind of with this tectonic feature, will be akin to a cosmological proposition that enacts rights for a radically different bundle of socio-ecological relations, in particular places vis-a-vis fluid legal frameworks. So the rise of nature as text recursively emerges from local ecologies and places with histories that cannot be transplanted into other places without some form of colonial damage. In brief, the rise of nature as text makes nature as network, or as a connection between different points, whereas the rise of nature as text makes cosmos as meshwork, something British anthropologist Tim Ingold calls a meshwork, which is the idea that every being in the world is a line of way or a line of development that crosses with one another. So I don't want to go too much into detail for the sake of time and to have the opportunity to discuss after the third presentation, but here is just, I will be happy to share this with whoever is interested as a way in which we can undergo this comparison both in concrete scenarios of adjudication or in a learning context. So in one of the columns, state proposition, we start with a pre-analytical assumption that there is something such as the rights of nature, whereas for communities like the Inga, there are not such a thing, for example. So we start with that pre-analytical assumption. There are some criteria of comparison between these two different enactments of law. One that consider that asks what is considered as existent, that who has rights to what, who has the right to speak in court, and that's something that can be predefined or can be emergent in the context where law and territory are one and the same, and so on and so forth. So I want to close the presentation with a couple of thoughts. I want to summarize a couple of takeaways by quoting an indigenous Inga thinker I work with. His name is Hernando Chindoy. He says, quote, Inga law is recognized in daily life as the existence of the infinite interrelations between human and non-human beings in their material and spiritual dimensions. Inga law is also found in the Inga language as one of its most important sources, but not the only one, where our forms of governance are revitalized. The methodology to recognize, he says, and study the law in our communities is to return to ancestral knowledge from a decolonized perspective and through our own language, symbols, dreams, and so forth. And this requires a special connection with different beings of the forest as a way to inform legal paradigms that damages our territories. In fact, also ingesting plants. So thank you so very much for listening. I want to acknowledge the Ingankofan communities I work with, and the program I'm part of. And thank you for the organizers of this event.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for that fantastic presentation. Really interesting to think about those different kind of worldviews and perspectives and how that can help us rethink the law. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you very much.
So, as I said, keep putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you can, because it will be Q&A soon. But of course, last but absolutely not least, we have Dr. Harriet Harden-Davies, who is going to be speaking about rights of nature as applied to the law of the sea. So, Harriet, over to you when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Emily. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Have you got my PowerPoint, and do you have it on full screen?
Yeah, all perfect.
Wonderful, excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this event today. As you mentioned in your introduction, Emily, my background perhaps does not set me up very well for a symposium on human rights and climate change, but what I do offer to do today is to offer some perspectives from some of my experiences working on marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, thinking about the global ocean commons and looking to rights of nature approaches as a source of inspiration. What I'll be doing is outlining some introductory points about this ocean area that lies far from shore, but is important to us all, why it matters from thinking about climate change and also the well-being of people, and how some of the challenges that are being faced in the negotiations for a new UN treaty that I'll introduce shortly might draw inspiration from rights of nature perspectives. And it's a real honor to speak after Dr. Kaufman and Dr. Vargas with those absolutely thought-provoking remarks and fantastic introductions to these comments. And hopefully I can pick up on some of those as we transition into our discussion. But first, I want to leave you, or sort of start you off looking at this this quote. Now, this is in the preamble of the draft text of a UN agreement that I'll be introducing very shortly. But what it's saying here is that states are desiring to act as stewards of the ocean on behalf of present and future generations. And I really want to sort of think about what that means in practice and to what extent rights of nature laws might help us think about actually giving effect to that idea. First, to the ocean, though. It's always a place that I like to position myself at the best of times, so particularly during these challenging times. Marine areas beyond national jurisdiction cover 2/3 of the ocean surface, about 90% by volume. And you can see it's the light blue space here is that the high seas and the deep seabed would be a little bit of a smaller area than what you're seeing in light blue. Now, this area is, of course, very far from shore, but it connects us all in many ways. And it's very important for coastal communities as well. You're seeing in this figure here by Popova et al. Is showing the way that ocean currents are connecting what happens in the high seas to coastal communities, particularly those coastal communities that are reliant on the ocean for sustainable development needs and facing very severe challenges in the face of climate change. What lives in the ocean? We know that marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction is incredibly diverse, and it's important for us all, from microscopic plants in the sunlit surface to enormous whales or turtles that migrate from the middle of the ocean to coastal communities and are often of incredible importance for the culture of different people. As we go down through the depths, the creatures get more weird and wonderful, from the sort of twinkling lights of the jellies that you'd encounter in the mid-ocean water column to the deep sea bed, coral gardens, deep sea canyons, or hydrothermal vents. Life in the global ocean is diverse, but we also know that it's under threats, particularly in these marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, which belong to us all and also none of us at the same time, and therefore have some unique challenges for governance that I'll speak on shortly. But marine life and the services that it provides to us all is challenged by human activities, from fishing to new things like seabed mining in future, perhaps geoengineering, forms of pollution from activities such as shipping or dumping or other things. Climate change exacerbates all of these. Climate change is leading to an ocean that's warmer, that holds less oxygen and is more acidic. And this has very serious consequences for the people who depend on the ocean, and indeed all of us. I'm sure this week we've talked a lot about sea level rise and as one of the very serious impacts of climate change on people. I'd like to give an example here about fisheries as well. Tuna, particularly here, we're looking at the Pacific Islands, is incredibly important as a source of revenue for countries. Particularly here, we can see, for example, in this modeling done by the Pacific Community from 2016, countries such as Tokelau has 98% of its government revenue coming from tuna. So it's incredibly important for these states. Under climate change, there's some very serious concerns about what will happen. What you're seeing in the top figure is the distribution of skipjack and yellowfin tuna in 2005. And the bottom two is showing the likely redistribution under a climate change scenario to 2050. As tuna shifts east, this could have incredibly serious consequences for the people of the Pacific Islands and their lives and livelihoods. And I'm highlighting this very solemn and serious point to illustrate how what happens in the global ocean, in the middle of the ocean, has serious consequences for all of us, but perhaps most relevant in this context for the most vulnerable coastal and ocean dependent people. In the second part of this talk, I'd like to introduce this new UN Ocean Treaty, and then I'll turn to how we might look for rights of nature as a source of inspiration for addressing some of the challenges. This new UN Ocean Treaty is called for shorthand the BBNJ Agreement, because particularly for people who don't have an international law background, it has a very long title. So it's a new international legally binding instrument for the conservation and sustainable use of that marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, and it's under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's that will be the third implementing agreement under the convention. This BBNJ agreement, for short, has been in preparation for a long time. As early as 2002, discussions began, an informal working group established in 2004, a preparatory phase since 2015, and then since 2018, we've been in the Intergovernmental Conference. The fourth and final scheduled Intergovernmental Conference has recently been postponed again for obvious reasons, but is likely to take place next year. So the international community has put a lot of effort into negotiating a new agreement to conserve and sustainably use marine life in our global ocean commons. Let me explain why. When the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, was adopted in 1982, in the preamble, one of the things we see there is that the problems of ocean space are interrelated and need to be considered as a whole. So the idea that the ocean is holistic, it's interconnected, it's dynamic, has been known for a very long time and recognized in the Law of the Sea Convention. But despite that, we know that the governance framework for the ocean is not so interconnected. In this soup of acronyms that you can see, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk about this in exhaustive detail. I'll refer you to Robin Warner and Jeff Ardron's book for this. But we can see that there are a number of different organizations responsible for different parts. Some organizations look after shipping, like the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO. Others, the International Seabed Authority, responsible for seabed mining. Other organizations responsible for fisheries. So we have this approach whereby sectoral organizations are responsible for managing different activities on the ocean. What's far more difficult is having approaches that manage the dynamic and interconnected ocean and provide for the establishment of measures that can protect the ocean as a more holistic approach. And so the development of this UN treaty is trying to fill that gap. And there's 4 key elements that are on the table and a number of cross-cutting issues that are relevant when we think about attempts to try to provide a more holistic approach to looking after the ocean and the way it looks after us. Firstly, establishing area-based management tools like protected areas. Secondly, having an approach towards environmental impact assessments and decision-making process to see what activities can take place. Thirdly, ensuring that all can have the capacity to implement this agreement. Fourthly, sharing in the benefits of genetic resources. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And finally, some cross-cutting but broader issues around how this works in practice, the institutional arrangements, information sharing mechanisms, and of course, how such agreements are actually funded and financed to work in practice. To give you an illustration as to why this is important for thinking about climate change and the ocean future, there's a number of different ways that scientists have identified that this agreement could be significant, and the UN agreement, the draft text as it currently stands itself, has recognized this. In the general principles, the importance to build ecosystem resilience to climate change is front and center. The role of area-based management tools like protected areas as climate refuges to build resilience to climate change is also there. Strategic environmental assessments has been a more contentious issue, but has been part of the discussions as a way to try to move beyond an environmental impact assessment approach, and also to recognize cumulative impacts like climate change in decision-making and go beyond a sort of siloed activity by activity situation. And importantly, there are discussions around the building of capacity so that there is the knowledge available and the tools there to be able to actually implement the conservation and sustainable use provisions that will be there in this agreement as it's adopted. But of course, it's not all smooth sailing. I suppose it never is. This is the room in the basement of the United Nations where the 3rd UN Intergovernmental Conference was taking place in 2019. Some of the key challenges that we're seeing in this agreement, been in development for a very long time, relate to fundamental issues around equity and around how we see the ocean as an interconnected whole. Ultimately, a number of these challenges really relate to some resistance on the part of some states to move beyond more traditional approaches to thinking about the rights to use the ocean and to enact responsibilities to protect and preserve. The freedom of the high seas is a very long-standing principle, but the responsibilities to protect and preserve the environment have not been such a focus as they are now. At the same time, questions around who can benefit and who can participate, what the meaning of the common heritage of mankind, the global ocean is today and going ahead, has still been a topic of contention. And we've seen incredibly slow progress on certain aspects of the issues, particularly around having a forward-looking approach to building capacity, to challenging marine genetic resource governance, and to thinking about how we can have cooperation that goes beyond, I won't get in your way if you don't get in mine, and having a far more holistic approach towards collaborating on some of these issues. And so for that reason, my colleagues and I found it really interesting to look outside of the law of the sea box and to see what rights of nature laws are doing about this and how that might give some inspiration for some of the solutions. So when we looked at some of the different laws, and this is the way my mind works, is to look at it geographically, and this is of course not a comprehensive list, we noticed that there are different ways, as Dr. Kaufman very eloquently outlined, that this is happening worldwide. We also noticed this is a relatively recent thing when we think about it in the context of the law of the sea timeline and the negotiations for this agreement. And that was really, really interesting for us to think about, well, what are some of the ways that this might influence perhaps the thinking in global ocean governance when we're thinking about ocean commons. In the remaining minutes, let me just run you through a few of the thoughts. So how might rights of nature perspectives give us inspiration for some of the challenges that we're seeing states grapple with the development of this new UN treaty? As my colleagues before me have mentioned, the idea that humans and nature are intrinsically linked, completely interdependent, and that connectivity demands a holistic approach. But that's something that is still missing from the overarching discourse for the BBNJ negotiations, as well as more broadly in ocean governance. So learning ways or finding sort of suggestions for ways to really ensure we have that connectivity at the very heart of what we're doing here would be very valuable to go towards that more holistic approach. As part of that, one of the things that would be really helpful to see in this new treaty going ahead is a recognition of the full value and the full importance of marine life and the ocean for all of us. Even though the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity includes language which recognises the inherent value of marine life, we haven't seen that coming into this agreement language just yet. And that would be something that could be quite helpful to give us that foundation and avoid a commodification of nature or a focus purely on economic value, but thinking much more broadly about how marine life is important to all of us, including the cultural value that that may hold to some communities. As Dr. Vargas was also speaking, different ways of knowing and relating to the ocean is also something that this agreement has been tussling to address. We've seen the importance of traditional knowledge gradually recognised in the discussions of the agreement, but there's still a way to go to see how that thinking and that different way of knowing can really influence and inform the way in which the agreement is developed and then implemented in practice. And that's something that would be really useful to discuss further. The way in which different rights and the reciprocal relationship between humans and nature, that the right to use is hand in hand with the responsibility to conserve and preserve. The way in which some communities see nature not as property, but as a partner. Some of that thinking and some of the ways of actually giving effect to that would be really valuable in guiding the way in which our global ocean governance framework develops. Particularly, and Dr. Calvin was speaking to this, the realities of implementing these laws on the ground. What does this actually look like in practice? And what are the types of mechanisms being developed? Who could speak for the ocean? Are there ways in which the ocean-dependent people could have more of a voice in decision-making? Well, that's one of the ideas that we thought would be useful for further discussion. To give a couple of specific examples as I wrap up, when we look at the environmental assessments, the incremental development in which this treaty has developed in the context of ocean governance more broadly, we're still seeing quite a strong focus on an activity by activity base looking at environmental impacts. If we could find a way of bringing in fresh perspectives and thinking to think much more seriously about the responsibility to respect ecological limits, to think about the knowledge that we need and the way in which we can enact precautionary approaches in a more meaningful way than has been done so far, that would be very useful. And examples from rights of nature laws that reverse the onus of proof can be a powerful source of inspiration in this regard. Secondly, for area-based management measures like protected areas as an example, having very clear obligations to protect the ocean that go just beyond the sort of duty to cooperate, for example, but a very clear set of obligations, but also a clear set of provisions and mechanisms to ensure they're implemented in practice would be very important to make sure this is more than a treaty on paper, but does lead to some change in practice as well. Marine genetic resources is a big topic in itself, and it's one that we don't have time to talk about in detail. But ultimately, when we think about how do we conceptualize nature, even the very idea of talking about a genetic resource in itself is does not sit comfortably with many different ways of seeing the world. And I think the more that we can bring in voices who can explain different ways of conceptualizing nature and not sort of reducing marine life down to a potential dollar value for a pharmaceutical product that could be developed, but thinking much more deeply about what that means, can make sure that we are adopting that holistic approach. Many of the capacity building discussions so far have again been quite sort of reduced to a particular focus, like a training course here or something like a new data system here. Now, they're all very important measures, but at the same time, we can also, I think seriously about the way in which the international community can collaborate in a very proactive way to have a collective capacity to be able to implement the obligations in this agreement and to ensure that it is delivering the types of long-lasting benefits for the ocean and the people who depend on it into the future, and thinking about that global community acting as global stewards for an area of enormous global ocean commons. And finally, it's a point about voice that I'd like to end on. This is something that both of my fellow panelists have mentioned. Who could speak for the ocean beyond national jurisdiction? How would that look in practice? With some of the more successful guardianship arrangements that Dr. Kaufman spoke about, would they be a source of inspiration? Could there be a way of ensuring that the interests of ocean-dependent guardians and custodians, people who are very much custodians of the ocean, that they could have a voice? Would there be other interests that could, in fact, come in place of that and perpetuate the problems? It's an idea. It's something that needs more discussion, but I hope it's something that would be interesting and useful for further consideration. So, stewardship of the ocean for present and future generations. I had two closing thoughts that both of my panelists have already mentioned, which is great. So hopefully this will bring us full circle. One of the first thoughts I wanted to speak about was actually terminology and framing. I think a lot of the time we talk about rights-based framing that can in fact be, doesn't sit well with the way in which certain coastal communities, ocean-dependent people see the ocean, experience the ocean and relate to the ocean. So I think the way in which we can develop this conversation around global ocean, how it links us all, will be really important to find language that's meaningful. So I really appreciated the framework put forward by Dr. Vargas to that regard. And secondly, when we think about why are we looking to rights of nature for inspiration for this treaty, it's because we've had years and years of things that look good on paper, but don't deliver in practice. And so we really think about what can we learn? Can we learn from rights of nature? Can we bring in some of these approaches? I think having a very practical focus to make sure that anything that ends up in paper in this treaty and in future is going to be implemented in practice will be really crucial. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and thank you again very much for bringing me in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Harriet. Really great kind of way to end the presentations, looking at how this can apply to obviously the law of the sea and ocean stewardship. So thank you very much for that. We have so many questions coming in right now. And if Sophie is there and can put us in gallery view, that would be good so we can see everyone. It's not just poor Harriet having her face on the screen in large. But no, it's fine, you're fine. But yeah, we have loads of questions. So I'm going to try my absolute best to answer or put as many of them to you as possible, but there really are quite a few. So we'll see how we go. But I want to start off with this question that's actually for all of you, and it's linking this really back to climate change as well. So it comes in from Jeremy Gilbert, who has a question for all of you, asking to what extent you feel the rights of nature could support new approaches to addressing climate change, recognizing maybe climate as having an ecosystem and therefore having rights. Have any changes like this happened in reality, and do you know of any kind of pushes for this in terms of international advocacy? I guess you all have your own different areas of focus within this potentially. So I don't know who would like to answer first. You can kind of wave at me maybe. There we go, Craig, you can do that. Go on, start us off, please. Thanks.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. I think there's one example in particular that's the most explicit link that comes to mind. And it's also a good example that I think addresses some of the other questions in the chat box, which is the Colombian, I believe it was the Supreme Court's ruling on the rights of the Amazon forest. And that is an interesting case because it explicitly connects human rights, rights of future generation, concerns about climate change, and rights of nature, sort of, and makes an argument that these things are all interconnected and linked. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with that case, the short of it is that it's one of these examples of a group of youth who make an argument about the rights of future generations to the court. They did some research and realized that in their country, the #1 driver of carbon dioxide emissions and therefore climate change was due to cutting of the Amazon rainforest. And so they chose that and basically asked the court to stop deforestation of the Amazon. The judge, in considering the case, both accepted and upheld the argument about the rights of future generations, but went further and basically made this argument that human environmental rights, including the rights of future generations, are dependent on the rights of ecosystems to be able to exist and maintain the functioning of their cycles. In other words, and this is part of a larger trend that we're seeing in courts in Latin America, and that's now being expressed in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, because one of the questions asked about existing international law. And you're starting to see courts make this argument that rights of nature may be a necessary precondition for the enforcement of human environmental rights, including in the realm of climate change. So.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig. Harriet, Ivan, do you want to jump in? You don't have to as well. You can answer which questions you want. No. Okay. Ivan, yeah?
Yeah, I'm just going to say something quick. Now that Dr. Kaufman mentioned this particular ruling, and I think it's important also to, in the context of other questions, that in Latin America, there is all this classical tension between, having all this very interesting forward thinking in law, this ecocentric orientation of law, like the rights of nature, the Constitution of Ecuador, like this ruling by the high courts, the Trato River case, and many others. But at the same time, a very strong, persistent, and damaging extractivist agenda that it's ongoing. So that, if we think about climate change of the outcome of capitalism in a way, which is kind of a well-known argument, like having this context where you have very ecocentric paradigm shift happening in law with this, let's say, anthropocentric orientation of economic systems is not doing much, in my view. Is making this problem deeper and deeper. So that it's kind of going back to the old debate about law and economics. And I think it is the time is ripe, sorry, for kind of reenacting this debate. So that's one thought I wanted to put forward. And in terms of the implementation of this particular ruling in Colombia, for example, most of these rulings have to be implemented by local municipalities that might not have the administrative capacities and the financial power to really do what the ruling says. So in terms of, and I really like the distinction that Dr. Kaufman is putting forward between the legal theory of the rights of nature and what happens with these rulings, because what's happening with these rulings is that it's creating, in some instances, especially in those places where there are all these financial difficulties faced by local municipalities to implement these kinds of decisions. So again, it's a call for really trying to harmonize these two things. So yeah, I just leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much both for your thoughts on that one. This actually kind of relates quite nicely to a question that we have that's come in from Fatima Zara Debbie. So asking really about kind of corporate activities. And I'm kind of interested in your different perspectives on this one. So asks, do you see rights of nature as being mobilized to address the impact of corporate activities on the environment? And what are the key challenges to such mobilization in this context? And I think, I can see Ivan and Craig nodding, and I'm also wondering with Harriet, how this could also be thinking about kind of, in particular, deep sea mining, which would be kind of the big context in where you're looking at and the kind of ongoing negotiations around the mining code there. So again, whoever wants to answer first, you can kind of wave at me or just unmute yourself. Yeah, go on, Craig. Thank you.
I'll go first again. I mean, in the United States, the movement is almost entirely being driven by opposition to corporate activity and its effects on the environment. In particular, not all, but I would say, I think it's fair to say a majority, if not a vast majority, of the roughly 80 rights of nature ordinances that exist in cities around the country were created as a way to preempt and prevent natural gas fracking or oil fracking. So it's a dominant driver. You've seen some success. I would say like the biggest success is the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is probably one of the larger cities to have a rights of nature ordinance, did succeed in using that to chase away the fracking companies. I guess they decided it wasn't worth dealing with that and they went elsewhere. But a big challenge is the nature of these legal provisions in the United States because of our decentralized system and just sort of the politics of it, is that these are municipal ordinances, which are fairly easy to overturn through preemption law. So there's a lot of experimentation in the United States about, you know, trying to find loopholes through home rule charters and things like that. But I would say, you know, when you're looking at sort of what has the effect of these things been, it's been quite successful in raising awareness and mobilizing action and activity in response to corporate behavior against the environment, more so than it has been successful in getting judges to uphold these things. So again, if you sort of see this as an activity of trying to force norm and paradigm change in society, I think it's probably better to understand it through that lens.
Great, thank you very much, Craig. Harriet or Ivan, would you like to go? Harriet, yep, go for it.
Thank you for the question. There's three things sort of leap to mind when I think about the people who are advancing rights of nature agendas in the ocean, and thinking particularly here about sort of the work of people like Michelle Bender and Victor David, who are really sort of driving this forward. And not to speak for them, but some of the things that really strike me are, like, firstly, sort of efforts to have much stronger measures for protection, accountability, and oversight. And that's really crucial in sort of areas of the global ocean commons where that has been lacking in some areas. Secondly, efforts to give voice to people to speak up for the ocean and sort of help ensure that accountability is happening, but also the suggestions that are starting to emerge about mechanisms to potentially even think about ways of giving the ocean itself a voice. And this is early, but it's a discussion that I think's time may have come. And thirdly, I think also the actual sort of institutional measures and mechanisms for decision making, which vary a lot between different sectors and different areas of the ocean. But in those mechanisms for decision making, sort of, I think that the like rights of nature movement, as it is starting to really sort of spill into the global ocean, is really providing a fresh impetus to look critically at those institutional structures and those decision-making processes to sort of try to pinpoint the areas where perhaps there are stronger industry influences than maybe there should be, and think a lot more critically about ways to perhaps reverse the balance. And I think a real area in all of this is always going to be thinking about who's holding the power and who actually might be potentially sort of suffering at the edge. And I think that really sort of having in mind like the needs and interests of ocean dependent communities and people, as well as the interests of the ocean itself, will be the space, and that there's real ground for fruitful discussions in future.
Great. Thanks so much, Harriet. And Ivan, did you want to jump in on anything here? I thought you might have something to say on this one. So.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. I think it's a wonderful question, and I think it touches on the heart of this problem. I mean, again, I want to go back a little bit on what I said in the context of Latin America. Well, it seems to me that the more innovative conceptually and you become as a state in putting these ideas forward, the least protection, real protection on the ground, full communities have. And that paradox seems to me quite striking. I mean, in Colombia, since the Constitution of 1991, you have a multicultural constitution integrating indigenous legal traditions within within kind of the legal purview of the state. But at the same time, the mass and the genocidal, the killing of indigenous leaders over the last 25 years is just outstanding. Outrageous. So I don't know. There is something there to be reckoned with, to theorize further. And same with the economy. I mean, it's those territories where indigenous peoples live are the places of important resources, natural resources, oil, gas, and whatever, rare minerals and things like that. So. And there is a lot of outstanding protection for those territories as well in terms of national laws. But again, the corporate seems to kind of decide corporate power seems to decide what is the destiny of those territories. So there is something off, really off there that needs to be reckoned with urgently. So I don't know, I kind of see the effectiveness of the rights of nature as having creating this conversation, raising awareness as a mode of really foregrounding the needs has been very effective, but the transformative potential of law, at least in the Latin American context, seems to be still in its infancy. So these couple of thoughts.
Fantastic, thank you. Craig, yeah, did you want to jump in again? Go for it.
I just wanted to comment because I think that's a really important point. And I get this question all the time about, well, like, how effective has rights of nature been? And I think it's really important to remember that this is a process of global norm change, right? And if you think about human rights, if you can put it in comparison with human rights has been a dominant global norm for 100 years, and we still do not have universal enforcement of human rights, right? So I don't think it is reasonable to judge sort of the entire effectiveness of rights of nature based on whether or not violations continue. I think the kinds of violence against water protectors and other protectors of nature that we see, unfortunately, and sort of the heightened tension between the law and sort of corporate behavior is exactly the expected consequence of the strengthening of the rights of nature norm, just as, historically, even though we had human rights norms in the 40s, last century, in the 70s, 30 years plus later in Latin America, there was similar kind of tension with military, and so I think we have to understand this within the context of what it takes. System transformation doesn't happen overnight, and we have to sort of, I think it's important to understand what role law plays in this norm transformation and recognize that it can be important even if we continue to see violations, and that violations may increase due to the conflict that's exacerbated by the creation of new laws that reflect new values.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's a really important point to note. Something I often hear as well, what's the point if we can't actually enforce this, etc. And I think it's a really important point to note the fact that we just kind of need to change the way that we're framing things, and that in itself is also very important. Indeed, human rights are still not universal, I think is quite key to remember. And kind of on that connection between human rights and rights of nature, I know we touched on this a little bit in terms of the Colombian context, but we've got a few questions that are kind of asking a little bit about this. So we have Mohammed Omar Saeed, who is asking a bit about how, some things are being recognized in human rights as a kind of emerging recognition of kind of climate migration, but really just kind of asking what stage we're at in terms of kind of human rights and different approaches here. And this relates to a couple of questions from anonymous attendees as well, so who are really asking, well, are there kind of areas of human rights law or kind of other areas of law that you see potential for kind of bringing rights of nature in? So again, I'm thinking, Harriet, maybe with a BBNJ process, or some other suggestions we have there include dignity or conventional biological diversity. Do you kind of see any areas in particular that could have potential here, I guess, is the main question. So whoever would like to go first again. Yeah, Craig, would you like to jump in?
I guess I can start. Yeah, I mean,
thanks.
I see, so of course there's a basket of human rights, right? So it's not like there are different kinds of human rights, and there are definitely examples of rights of nature being strategically combined with other human rights by actors who think this can be helpful in advancing their cause through the courts, right? And so there are a number of example, I gave an example earlier about how many courts, like the Colombian Supreme Court and some courts in Ecuador and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, are explicitly linking rights of nature and human environmental rights, basically making the argument is, what good is it to recognize a right to clean water if you're not going to recognize a right of a watershed to produce that clean water? That's sort of the logic, right? But you're also seeing in Ecuador, Ecuador is unique because rights of nature is in its constitution, giving it a certain level of enforcement, capability that you don't see elsewhere. And what's interesting to me is that after about a decade of sort of experimenting and trying different things, you're starting to see quite a lot of indigenous communities in Ecuador combining arguments of rights of nature to strengthen their indigenous rights claims through these arguments about biocultural rights. And they do that in part because indigenous rights are recognized in international law, while rights of nature is not. And this gets at one of the questions somebody asked about, well, why might it be useful to have this international law declaration? Because when you have that, it strengthens claims by marginalized groups in domestic society, right? And so, you know, there's in Ecuador, for example, you have sort of claims that have been recognized by courts that use rights of nature to essentially weaponize ILO 150 or whatever about prior consultation. I can't remember the number, that basically says prior consultation has to be done in a way that's consistent with the cultural values of the local population. And then if you recognize that the local population is an indigenous community that sees themselves as having important ties to the local ecosystem, then you bring in the rights of nature sort of understanding from the Ecuadorian Constitution. It greatly expands their ability to basically invoke both, kind of combine indigenous rights of prior consultation with the rights of the ecosystem to which they are tied to exist. And that's been used effectively in Ecuador to annul mining concessions. So that's a very recent development. So it shows sort of this stuff has been evolving through the courts gradually, as one might expect.
Great, thanks so much. I see Ivan waiting to jump in there. So yeah, when you're ready.
Yeah, unless Dr. Davis wanted to say something first. Okay, good. Yeah, I was just, I want to, what Dr. Kaufman was saying reminded me of something that I heard from Patricia Walinga, indigenous leader in the Sarayaco region. She said that there are no human rights, there are no nature rights, there are rights, because they see humans and nature in an interconnected way. So, and that poses a question about, a question that is very practical and also very theoretical question about what happens in a context where we kind of create rights for almost everything, this kind of a conception of rights. Is that doing this separation that the rights of nature is trying to undo, in the sense that having a human right, a set of rights, and then rights of nature, and then biocultural rights, all seems to be kind of making this division in a very kind of tangible way, at least in the legal international system. So that's one point that I think is important to consider. In the Colombian case, for example, the Trato River case, Constitutional Court issued a sentence granting rights to the Trato River. That was precisely one of the important arguments, is that the riverine communities live because of the river is because of these communities. So this mutual interdependence, that has to be reflected or go from the realities on the ground, the realities of life, up to the law, which poses questions about what law is. So if for these communities, even beyond the idea of rights, if for these communities law exists in the territories in all these different ways, how can we make this jump or this kind of connection transition to a legal system that seems to divide everything? So just going back to the same point, how can we really, not only conceptually, but also in our adjudication practices, really enact this relational principle in a way that is effective? How can we narrow down the legal reality of having so much division in international system and national systems about rights, that adds up to the complexity of really people enacting law because they think that law is the territory itself. So is there room for the rights of nature for these kinds of conceptions of law that really are what are doing is challenging state law in a way that is very productive? So I think, can we transform the law via these relational ontologies, these relational ways of thinking about, and what are the practical questions that emerges when we really come attuned with this insight So it's fascinating. Legal, I mean, from the legal theory point of view, is very challenging to implement, because I agree with what you said, Dr. Kaufman, about the temporality of assessing what happens with this. I think we need more time to see how effective it has become, but I think having clear sense of the critique that of what indigenous legal traditions is doing is really critiquing the idea of the law as something that is a state or international state crafted. That kind of is a good start, I think. So.
Thank you. Harriet, did you want to jump in here, or are you okay on that one? Yeah.
It's on time, so I'll just keep it to 10 seconds. Just to give a really sort of concrete example as to why the point that Dr. Vargas was just making is so relevant. We think about this, ocean area beyond national jurisdiction. I mean, I think that at the very least, these types of conversations, these ways of thinking, give a new edge to the argument as to where to protect and why, and who should have a say in that, and how should that happen in practice. But at best, it actually turns the whole thing on its head, because instead of saying, well, these species live here and they give us, it's a very instrumental thing, like the ocean gives this to us and it's X billion dollars in value for this industry. It's saying, well, no, we have a different way of thinking about how we connect with nature and how that translates in a very practical sense into the way that we govern it. And that's where I think that there's real scope for innovation.
Definitely. Thank you so much. We did have a really excellent question also that came in from Christina Jurda around the kind of Council of Ocean Custodians, and I think probably don't have time to answer it, but I want to note that one because I think Harriet and you and Christina should probably have a chat about that one, because I think it's a really good one. But I'm sorry, Christina, that I didn't get to your question. We just ran out of time because we had so many amazing insights, and I think some fantastic points made on that last question as well. So I need to wrap it up for the sake of time. I'm very sorry. We had so many more questions as well from lots of people. But I just want to thank you all so much for those fascinating presentations and for answering the questions so well. So much to think about there as well. So thank you all. And I would like to hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Stephen Turner, who organised the symposium, to say the final words.
So thank you so much, Emily. And firstly, let me say a big thank you to Craig, Harriet and Iban for such an interesting and inspiring session. It really was truly inspiring and also I would say extremely important. So thank you to all of you. And thank you, Emily, for not only chairing that, but also for bringing this panel together. Thank you so much. Over the last 3 days, we've had a wonderful series of discussions and presentations and some incredible talks with incredible insights and so much practical leadership that's been demonstrated through all of those sessions. So we hope that it has been beneficial and enjoyable for you in the way that it has been for us. But sadly, it is, of course, time to close the symposium now. So on behalf of the Law School and the Human Rights Centre at Essex University, I just want to thank everybody that's attended these sessions. We hope that the symposium has been beneficial for you. If there are sessions that you've missed that you would like to view, the videos will be available through the Essex University web pages. And of course, I want to thank again all of the speakers and chairs that have made these last 3 days so successful and so inspiring. But particularly this symposium would not have been possible without the support and partnership of certain key organizations. So in particular, I would like to say a special thank you to the Environmental Law Institute, Washington, DC, University of Beirut, Germany, the University of East Anglia in the UK, the Global Environmental Rights Institute and Dignity Rights Project in the USA, and Widener University and Delaware Law School. So I especially want to name just a few people that have been involved in bringing this together. I've named a couple already, but I'd like to thank Jimmy May, Erin Daly, Shana McLean, Abadan Kent, and Toko Kaime from the institutions that I've just mentioned, who've worked closely with us in bringing this together. I want to say just a special thank you to colleagues here at Essex University, You've met Emily, of course, so thank you to Emily, but also to Bersha and to Sophie Conlon, who's been working behind the scenes to do all of the technical side, which makes this happen. So just finally, I'd like to say thank you to everybody again, and to hope that you will stay in touch with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.